Hi there. We're here with the BFG. That's actually the title of this chapter. You can find it on page 25. We have two chapters we're going to read today. The first one we will have probably read in class, but in case you missed it or you'd like to review it, here it goes again. We'll read the BFG, and then we'll read the next one, the Giants. Eek. Page 25. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he's really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and they seemed to be able to move him inwards and outwards from his head as he wished.
"I is hungry,"
the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. What a great description. I can definitely picture that. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter.
"Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch!" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks."
Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?"
"Bone Crunching Giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting like turkey."
"Oh, I suppose they would," Sophie said.
"Of course they would!" the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious, and some is ucky slush. Greeks is full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks, ever."
"Why not?" Sophie asked.
"Greeks from Greece is tasting greasy," said the giant said.
"Well, I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering, with a bit of tremble, what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at all of his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food.
"As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats."
"Why hats?" Sophie said.
"You is not very clever," the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. "I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle."
Whatever that is. Do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food.
"You is trying to change the subject," the giant said sternly. "We is having an interesting conversation. Sorry. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable.
Oh, but the bean is a vegetable.
Not the human being, the giant said. The human being has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all.
Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross or angry.
The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales.
You mean whales, Sophie said. W-H-A-L-E-S. Wales, W-A-L-E-S, is something quite different.
Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Okay. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigan sweaters.
You mean jerseys, Sophie said.
You are doing it once again, gobble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue?
Please do, Sophie said.
Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on.
Oh, of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. I get it.
Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thighs. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors.
Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked.
Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes.
Aren't you getting them a bit mixed up? Sophie said.
I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best. And I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper.
Wellington? Sophie said. Where is Wellington?
Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. Well, so says the welly-eating giant.
And what do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked.
Boots,
the giant said. Oh, of course, said Sophie. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than to be kept hanging around anymore. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling.
Me!
Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves.
Me gobbling up human beings! This I never! The others, yes, all the others is gobbling them up every night. But not me. I is a freaky giant.
That just makes me laugh. I'm sorry.
I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What's your name?
My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news that she had just heard. The giants are on the next page. But if you are so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why did you snatch me from my bed and run away with me?
Because you saw me, the big friendly giant answered. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away hip switch."
"Why?" asked Sophie.
"Well, first of all," said the BFG, "human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist."
"Oh, I do," Sophie said.
"Ah, but that's only because you has seen me," cried the BFG. "I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around yodeling the news that you are actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, would be starting up all over the world, with human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me in a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into a zoo or the a bumpkin house with all of those squiggling hippo dumplings and crocodile dillies."
He's kind of mixed up. Page 32. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world.
"I will bet you," the giant went on, "that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away?"
"Well, I suppose I would," Sophie said.
"And that would never do," said the BFG.
"So what will happen to me now?" Sophie asked.
"If you go back, you will be telling the world," said the BFG. "Most likely on the telly bumpkin box and the radio squeaker. You will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life."
"Oh, no!" cried Sophie.
"Oh, yes," said the BFG. "But I am warning you not to ever go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one little tiny glimpse of you."
The big friendly giant picked Sophie up off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. "Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked. Sophie, squinting through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks, about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, every one." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked, except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were. Many of them had large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and, well, perhaps maybe that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked.
"Nothing," said the BFG. "They is just moochling and foochling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers."
"You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said.
Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course, said the BFG. But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places like Wellington for the booty flavor and Panama for the hatty taste. Every giant is having their own favorite hunting ground.
Do they ever go to England? Sophie asked.
Often, said the BFG. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of cod scallop.
I am not sure I quite know what that means, Sophie said.
Meanings is not important, said the BFG. I cannot be right all of the time. Quite often, I is left instead of right.
And are all of those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people? Sophie asked.
All of them is guzzling human beings every night, the BFG answered. All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers upon you. You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop.
But eating people is horrible, Sophie cried. It's frightful. Why doesn't anyone stop them?
And who, please, is going to be stopping them? asked the BFG.
Well, couldn't you? Said Sophie.
Never in a pig's whistle, cried the BFG. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness.
Twice as high as you? Cried Sophie.
Easily that, said the BFG. You was seeing them in the distance, but just you wait till you get them up close. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall with huge muscles and cockles alive, oh!
And I is the titchy one.
I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country.
Well, you mustn't feel bad about it, Sophie said. And I think you're just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages.
Bigger, said the BFG, looking pleased. They is as big as bumple hammers.
How many giants are out there? Sophie asked.
9 altogether, answered the BFG.
That means, said Sophie, that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive.
More, said the BFG. It is all depending, you see, on how big the human being is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before he is feeling all full up. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, those are the Americans, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in.
But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? Sophie asked.
All countries excepting Greece is getting visited sometime or another, the BFG answered. The country which a giant visits is depending on how he is feeling. If it is very warm weather and a giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far up into the Frisbee North to get himself an Esquimau or 2 to cool him down. A nice fat Esquimau to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly or a popsicle for you.
Well, I'll just have to take your word for it, Sophie said.
And then again, if it is a flatsy night and the giant is fidgeting with cold, he will probably point his nose towards the sweltering hot lands to guzzle up a few Hottentots to warm him up.
How perfectly horrible, Sophie said.
Nothing hots a cold giant up like a hot Hottentot, said the BFG said.
And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk around among them now, Sophie said, would they really eat me up?
Like a whiff swiddle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you is so small that they wouldn't even have to chew you.
The first one to be seeing you would pick you up with his fingers and down you'd go like a drop of drain water.
Oh, let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them.
So now we have entered giant country. These giants are twice the size of the BFG. The BFG is 24 feet tall. That means these guys are 50 feet tall. That's incredible. 49 to 50. I know you're checking my math right now. I'm on to you. But they're all about 50 feet tall. That is like a 5-story building. That's like as tall as the hospital. Is that crazy? Well, at least we have BFG in our corner. And all of his beautiful made-up words. How confusing are those? Thanks for listening. We'll talk more. Be sure you tackle that assignment tonight or this afternoon. Talk to you soon. Bye.